Hi.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Welcome to Center for Local Prosperity, our webinar. I'm glad you could join us today, the day before Halloween and the day before the Blue Jays win the World Series. Had to throw that in there, if you'll excuse me. Okay. I would like to give you first a little bit of background. I'm going to make some introductions and then we'll get underway. And I think we should start recording. If you haven't done that yet, Liv, okay, thank you.
Yep, it's going.
Okay, this is Center for Local Prosperity, our 7th webinar in a series. We started last spring, and because of the times we're in, particularly with trade wars and so on, and the need for localization, really that type of conversation started up very quickly last spring. We decided to host these monthly series. We looked at local investment. We looked at business cooperatives, localized energy, housing alternatives. Last month was on food, a very good one. And today we're going to be talking about local procurement. My name's Robert Cervelli. I'm the Senior Advisor for CLP on the call here as well. We have Andy Horsnell, Executive Director, Liv Langell, who's Program Manager, and Nike, who just joined us a month ago as Communications Coordinator. A little bit about CLP. We're 11 years old. We're a registered charity. We work across Atlantic Canada with small rural and local communities, helping them to relocalize their economy, to gain more agency over their future, particularly in the age of globalization. And so that's why today's topic, I think, is an excellent one and it's an important one. Really kind of think in some ways kind of critical. I'd mentioned the trade wars. Those, of course, I'm not just talking about US and Canada and the tension there. I'm talking about really international and what's going on, because that's going to affect all manner of things, pricing, availability, supply chains, and so on. I think of one saying that came out of COVID, actually, where they said it's time to switch from, this was the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, I believe. They came out with a tagline, it's time to switch from just in time to just in case supply chains. So that's part of what we're talking about. We did conduct a study a number of years ago on import replacement across the region and the value of that. And I think, Liv, if you could put that study in the chat box. But then also localizing procurement. It's been well known, studies have been done, some excellent examples internationally, that it's a beautiful economic stimulator. It really builds local supplier capacity, so on. We did a study with 4 organizations and looking at how they were spending their money and what the potential benefit could be for a 10% shift to local. And I think Liv will be providing that study as well. So what I'd like to do, we've got an excellent set of speakers here today, and I'd like to just give a little bit of background. Kimberley Murphy is on the call. She is the Manager of Procurement Engagement for Nova Scotia, Services Nova Scotia. The government of Nova Scotia spends just over $1 billion a year in procurement to keep everything running. So there's an economic engine right there. And that's one of her jobs, is to implement a sustainable procurement strategy and to really start to focus more on supplier community and supplier engagement locally within the province. And Kimberley also has a bigger lens. She's been the president of the Canadian Public Procurement Council. So really glad to have you with us here today, Kimberley. Also on the call is Chaiti Seth. Chaiti is an instructor with the Environmental and Sustainability Studies Department at Acadia University. She's a mother, a farmer, researcher, and experiential educator from India. She's studied extensively in postgraduate work, sustainability, particularly around food systems and what are transformative processes. She was very heavily involved going back to about 2016 in a process at Acadia University studying the needs for food procurement and then helping to renegotiate the contract with the major provider, the food caterer there. And that was quite a learning experience. And Chaiti then went on to do postgraduate work on processes like that for other institutions. And then we may have Andy Horsnell speak in very briefly on some of the work that we're currently doing, Center for Local Prosperity in Cape Breton. So I think with that, I'd like to get underway and maybe what we could do. Oh, just before we do, I want to say that we'll ask our speakers to say a few things. We're going to have some conversation about local procurement. As questions come up, if you could put those in the chat box, that would be fantastic. And we're going to have Liv be monitoring that, and we'll have time towards the end to get to questions. So maybe what I'd like to do is, Kimberley, if you could give us just a brief description of the Sustainable Procurement Strategy that you're managing for the province.
Sure. So in June of this year, we launched our Sustainable Procurement Strategy and Action Plan. And it's based on a 3-year program or a 3-year implementation plan that will deal with a number of different pillars. One of them would be social equity and diversity, the environment, Indigenous accessibility, Nova Scotian, and ethical. And so we're working from a number of different areas to ensure that when we make purchases, whether they're low value or high value, they do have sustainable features or at least sustainable considerations within each of those purchases. We've done a lot of things to make it easier within the recent past for smaller suppliers, local suppliers, to work with us. And we'll talk about those a little bit later, I think, Robert. And so the basis of the Sustainable Procurement Strategy and Action Plan is to build into our procurement practices tools and tactics and opportunities for sustainable procurement in all levels of the things that we do. So we're at the beginning phase to bring those things into practice, but the main goal is to make it so that we are one of the forefront runners in the province for doing this sort of thing on a public level. We were the first province in Canada to implement a sustainable procurement policy back in 2009. And so this year, just actually last year, we revised that policy and we took out the word sustainable in the beginning of it because we believe that sustainability needs to be built into our best practices every day. So it should just be it's our public procurement policy now. And so there we go forward. And as we move through the action plan, we are building all of those things into the possibilities of what public procurement can do, whether it's low value or high value.
So you're right in front and center, it sounds like, with the engagement in your title, where the people that are spending the money on the governments and department side and the vendors who are looking to receive those contracts, and I even working with them and identifying them and getting them in the process.
Yeah, so the role that I play in procurement is not one that you would think in terms of a traditional procurement role. I'm not a procurement specialist or category manager. I don't deal directly with writing the contracts, the RFPs, or any of the contract management. But my job is to make sure that all of the public sector entities understand where they fit within the Public Procurement Act. Our department staff, so all public servants in Nova Scotia, need to understand their role in public procurement and where they fit, what the ethics and conflict of interest and what the policies are. We build those resources for them. And then we also build a lot of resources for our suppliers so that they know they can find public procurement opportunities, either through our public procurement portal or individually with departments. So we do a lot of work on the engagement side of things to make sure people understand the rules, the legislation, and are also aware that they can come to us with questions if they have any, and we can help them work through our systems and processes.
Sounds like that's quite a lot going on. Thank you.
It's a lot. It's a busy job.
Yeah, you're keeping busy, I can tell. Chaiti, like to go to you and tell us a little bit about what happened at Acadia and then some of the follow-on work that you've been doing, some of the research you've been doing.
Yeah, so things at Acadia around sustainable food have been happening for, we're getting on to almost 20 years, I would say, and there's been different phases, as you can imagine, of different levels of involvement. But one of the things about food at an institution is that we have a lot of people in different departments and programs that have either knowledge or like a real interest in food. So folks from nutrition, obviously folks from sustainability, folks from a community development perspective, folks from a sociology perspective and food insecurity. And so that's really been one of the strengths of doing this work here. And so I came into the work in around 2015, 2016 as a research assistant, and to kind of bring some energy into, there were a lot of folks at Acadia who wanted to see things happen with food, but which is also not unusual at institutions, there's rarely someone whose job it is to just look at what the food system in an institution looks like. And this is true across many institutions. So as I speak, I'll keep kind of referring to, there are some things that we learned that are post-secondary specific in terms of how the institutional food system works. But part of my research was really to say, what is it that we're doing here? What is it that we've learned that can apply more broadly, right? So there's some things that can apply to all post-secondary institutions who have an external food service provider, which is the majority of post-secondary institutions in Nova Scotia, but really across North America. And then there are some things that are, they have to be kind of adapted if you're looking at it in the context of a hospital or a school, a public school. And so we'll kind of talk about what the transferability of some of these findings is. But I initially came in just with the purpose of saying, can we understand, like, we know we'd like to have more local food. We know we'd like to have more sustainable food. We know we'd like to have more kind of better standards around social justice, animal welfare. We know that a few faculty are interested. We know that students are really impacted by the food system. It's one of the things in a very early report I did was how many students in their first year talk about the food that they eat to their families or friends, right? And so it's something that has a significant impact on their emotional well-being, on their mental well-being, on their physical well-being, and then that impacts how they're showing up in their classes. And so some of it was starting to see these links to the food system, but also recognizing that in most institutions, it's not something that's given the kind of attention that it maybe deserves, given how much of an impact it has. And the potential it has for having a positive impact. So we actually used you were referring to the report that CLP put together around, what can the impact be if we have more local procurement? And we used reports like that to really demonstrate that in all of those ways, like the economic impact that this institution could have, how much of the money that Acadia is using for procurement could be shifted back to local communities. How does that improve community relationships with an institution, right? Like, how are we part of this local community and the producers, especially being situated in the Annapolis Valley? What is the impact on student well-being? And then what's the impact on the environment? So we actually have an ability to have positive impact in these multiple areas of outcome if we really think about what we're doing with our food. So just to kind of outline the stages, a significant amount of work, and there were multiple people involved in multiple stages, was having multiple rounds of consultation with students, recognizing that they're the people who are eating the food primarily. If we look at numbers, the highest proportion of people who are eating on campus, who are being served by the food service, are students. And so starting to get a sense of like, well, where are they at? What do they want? What do they relate to? What information do they need to start to care more about local procurement and sustainable procurement? The second part of it, so we did four rounds of consultation happen. So really starting to paint a picture of saying like, what's the need? And the other piece of it was starting to get a really good sense. And this was maybe one of the, not surprising, but one of the findings that people are often surprised by when I talk about it is how much doing institutional food system transformation work requires really solid organizational understanding. So I looked actually at a lot on like organizational structures, business, like literature from that world, because institutions have very specific hierarchies and ways in which systems work. And if we don't understand them, then we don't understand the points of leverage within the system in order to be able to make effective change. Again, recognizing that there's often very limited resources to do this kind of work in institutions. So there was that piece. And then finally was like really looking at the nitty gritty of like procurement. So the amount of time that I spent just like staring at massive spreadsheets of like, where does the $1 million budget that Acadia spends every year on just procuring ingredients, where is that going? And can we even, like, what information do we have? What information do we not have that we need to start getting that needs to make its way down the supply chain? And then just really being like, okay, so what of these can we meet locally? Where do we need to find producers who can produce a larger amount, or maybe produce carrots in a way that the kitchen can actually recognize, right? So getting a sense of like, what are the details of the picture, so that when we're talking about the big picture visioning of what kind of food system do we want, we're also really tying that to the practicalities of what the institution uses and what's available, so that our solutions are pretty realistic and practical. So yeah, that was another piece of it. And then I'd say the final piece of it is really looking at policies. And so again, I'll reiterate that my research was in the context of when an institution has externalized their food system. So they are hiring a food service provider. And we have a very limited number of large corporations in North America who hold most of these food services contracts. So when an institution has hired and is in a contractual agreement with a food service provider, what are the points of leverage, but also what are policies at the institutional end? What are policies in the food, like internal corporate policies for the food service provider? And then what are provincial regulations? So for example, around meat inspection, that are really constraints, but also points of opportunity. And one of the reasons why I was really interested in this research is that because, one of the hard things is that we're so centralized. There's such few companies, everything is like we're moving through massive systems. The advantage or the opportunity there is that which we were able to do in a couple of instances that were quite significant, if we're able to make a change, either at the institutional level in our policies, or in some cases, we pushed for change in corporate policy, that doesn't just open a door for us at Acadia, that actually opens a door for anybody who is working with that provider. So for example, if we make it possible for institutions to buy provincially inspected meat so that we can get more local or smaller scale farms that are having more sustainable practices, that actually is something that somebody else can also do, provided they know to ask about it. So part of my work is like kind of sharing that knowledge out, because it's not often the corporations are coming back and being like, hey, we can do this really cool thing now because we have this policy or we opened this door. So I really feel like part of my job in advocacy is to be like, hey, go ask these questions, because these things are actually possible. Now, yeah, maybe I'll pause there.
I'm amazed at the many years, the depth of engagement with the students to really understand their thoughts and priorities and how they would like to see things happening, understanding how the whole system worked. And then you're in a perfect position now to be able to go out and help replicate the whole process from that depth of learning with other institutions, not just in the Maritimes or even just Canada, but potentially even internationally. So that's fantastic. And it's always curious for me that Acadia in particular is really kind of in the food belt of the whole region. And it would be food to be even more front and center, I would think, at Acadia and in the Wolfville area.
Yeah.
So yeah. Andy, I'd like to jump over to you real quick. And if you could explain some of the work that we started earlier this year in Cape Breton with Anchor Institutions.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. So the Center for Local Prosperity received funding from the province through the CED fund to work with 5 public sector anchor institutions in Cape Breton, including the Sydney waterfront campus of NSCC, which is represented today by Carol Arsenault. And the work we're doing with them is to kind of 2 parts. One is to do a baseline spending analysis of those 5 organizations to get just a sense of like how much is like where are they spending their money in terms of like immediately local, regional, provincial, larger regional, national. And then the second part will be to within that look at specific opportunities to relocalize small portions of their spending. So our targets are quite conservative. hoping to identify something like, 5, 10% would be a home run, but something like 5% relocalizing spending across the range of spending, recognizing that there are certain types of spending that are kind of lend themselves to relocalization, food being probably the primary one. And we're set up well in Cape Breton in that there's a natural aggregator in the Cape Breton Food Hub that could help mediate between small producers and those anchor institutions. And so that'll play out between. We're really just in recruitment phase right now. We've got 3 anchor institutions, 3 of the 5 confirmed, the 2 NSCC campuses and New Dawn Enterprises, and we're in conversation with another 5 other organizations. We need 5 in total to go, so we're good there. We'll do the spend analysis start in December, January, then we'll get into the identifying opportunities February to March, and then kind of final reports as we ease into the early summer. So, and in the midst of that, we'll be making a separate application to do the folks on the supply side of the equation. So when we start identifying opportunities, like part of that will be identifying which, it only becomes an opportunity if there are local vendors that can respond to that spending. So we'll start the process initially within the context of this project, but we do hope to have a funded project that would follow on from this piece of work, where we would come alongside the local vendors who may be, with a little bit of assistance, may be able to respond to what for them might be just a huge business opportunity, and getting even just a small percentage of spending from these large institutions could be transformative for small vendors on the island. So that'll fingers crossed that'll go forward beyond like June. We're looking to wrap up this current project in June, and then going forward on the supply side after that.
That could be quite a valuable study, because Cape Breton, it's somewhat of an interesting economic case study, just because of how it's geographically located, and there's a certain loyalty, I think, to the island there, and to see how that plays out. So demand and supply, the demand side, people that need goods and services, they've got the money and the budgets, and then they're reaching out on the supply side to see who can provide those goods and services, and really the potential to grow the supplier capacity in that particular region be quite interesting. That's fantastic. I do want to suggest to anybody, if you've got questions for any of the 3 panelists, go ahead and put them in the chat box, and we're going to save some time a little later to get into that. I would, at the risk of using another analogy, I'd like to talk about low-hanging fruit. Okay, and maybe Kimberley, to start with you. This is a relatively new plan. It rolled out earlier this summer, I think. And so you're really working your way into it. You've got a lot of work to do. Where do you see the early gains coming in with this new strategy?
I think right now the early gains can be seen in the changes that we've made to some processes that may have been prohibitive before for suppliers. So from a departmental perspective, we've done a lot of things to allow them to make their purchases with local suppliers a little easier. So we've increased our procurement card spend threshold from $2,500 to $5,000. So that means that those public sector, departments that have purchasing cards, like a Visa card, can go directly to our suppliers and pay up to $5,000. So there was no additional authorization or anything that's required. The other thing that we've done is increase our ministerial approval for spending from $5,000 to $10,000. So that means that our departments can go direct to suppliers to purchase things for up to $10,000. The benefit of having the P card increase is that means money right into your hands right away. There's no invoicing process that can take a little bit of time. And then the value of increasing the ministerial approval means that departments can make purchases quicker without having to go through the process sometimes of requesting formal approval for that. The other thing that we have done is increase the value at which our departments can purchase from suppliers without having to go to public tender. So we are bound by the thresholds that are outlined in the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, Canada Free Trade Agreement. And so for goods, that has increased our ability to purchase from suppliers up to 33,400. So that's quite a bit of money that can be spent direct with a supplier without having to go to public tender. Anything over the $10,000 amount has to be offered to 3 suppliers for quotes, and then we would choose the one that provides us the best value from that. And then for services and construction, that value is 133,800. So anything under that value can be awarded directly to suppliers. And again, that $10,000 number is there to say that at the $10,000 mark, we need to go out for 3 quotes. So those few things can make it a lot easier and quicker for our departments to make decisions to buy the things that they need, that are not necessarily not complex, but that are at the value that doesn't need to go to public tender. And it just makes it a little bit easier for everybody. The other thing that government has done recently is to implement, it's probably been about a year and a bit now, the directive for favorable treatment of Nova Scotia businesses. And so what that means is that once that $10,000 trigger is met, and we have to go out for 3 quotes, that there's a 10% preference that we can apply to Nova Scotia businesses in terms of pricing. So if we go out for 3 quotes and the lowest bid is within 10% of a Nova Scotia bid, we can award to the Nova Scotia vendor if the lowest one is outside of the province. So that does give us a little bit more leeway in how we can spend our public taxpayers' dollars with local businesses. The key there is making sure that as a supplier, you understand which departments are the ones that would be most likely in the market for the goods and services that you have. It also means taking a look at what some of the bigger projects are that are happening around the province, and perhaps how you might be able to work with some of the larger vendors that are already contracted to work with government too.
So there's a certain onus on vendors to really understand which department could use their goods or services, and not just the tendering process, but be able to get visible really to people that need to spend money, get visible and start some kind of a relationship, it sounds like.
Yes. Yeah. And so that's the piece that sometimes can be a little bit overwhelming, but my job and the staff that I have are here to help guide suppliers through that process and figure out which departments would be most likely to need the goods and services that we have. The thing with the low value procurement is that anybody in government at any time could need to buy a good or service. And so that means that there isn't any centralization around those purchases. So they are able to go out and do it on their own. And so sometimes they need a little bit of guidance on how to find suppliers in their local region. And so they may come to us and ask, or they may look to their community. They may look to historical purchases and see who they've purchased from in the past. But part of the work that we're doing with the Sustainable Procurement Strategy and Action Plan is to build some resources to help our departments find those suppliers within the province that are able to do the work that we need. And when that happens, whether it's through building our own directory or taking advantage of some of the well-established directories that exist, we'll be making those resources available to our departments. So again, it's important for suppliers to know which departments they want to work with, and then also to let us know that they exist so we know to look for them.
So you're going to have to mobilize resources, like you said, to facilitate the whole process. Chaiti, by comparison, it strikes me that Kimberley, she's working across a whole system here, and it could be hundreds or even possibly even thousands of relatively small purchases, big contracts, and so on. In your case, you learned an enormous amount at Acadia. You've done further research at Systems Change. Where do you see that low-hanging fruit in terms of replication into other institutions?
Yeah, I mean, that was really the focus of my research, is like, what are the strategic leverage points when we look across the entire system? And so I would say one of the things that became very clear, because we're working in the context of contractual agreements, the contract itself is a massive leverage point. And I might ask, I had sent along like a little image, and so this might be a moment where that image might be helpful if we can throw it up on the screen. But one of the things that's true in a lot of institutions is that the folks who are primarily responsible for those contracts tend to be senior administrators in institutions. So they carry a lot of, there's a lot of power in terms of making that, signing off on that contract. But what's also true is that those aren't necessarily folks who have, they might be like the person who handles finances for the university may not be someone who has a deep understanding of food systems. And so one of the things that we came to realize was that there is this pretty significant disconnect. And so one of the points of leverage that we really found was ensuring that we have more stakeholders involved, because we have access to all of these folks in an institutional setting who can bring different kinds of expertise and also who have different kinds of leadership capacity. And that's really what that image is about. Is that something we can throw up on the screen? Okay.
I think I've got it here.
Okay.
Is this the one?
Yeah, this is the one. Can folks see it? If someone just gives me like a little, great. So one of the things that this kind of image was a way that I drew to illustrate what I mean by really mobilizing the different forms of power that are available. And so again, although this is in the context, the specifics of this image are in the context of post-secondary education, but I actually think there's a lot, through the process of my research, I realized there's actually a lot that applies in other institutions, and part of something that can be a really useful exercise if you're engaging in work to change food systems or really any kind of procurement system is to get an understanding of what the power dynamics are. So at Acadia or at post-secondary institutions, we have senior administration who are typically responsible for signing off on those contracts. So they have a lot of authority and decision-making, but the constraints that they have on their power is that they often lack expertise. Like when we went in and started chatting with the folks who were signing off on the food contract, they didn't know a lot about the food system, right? They were like, we don't even know what questions to ask. We don't know. We're not the ones who are typically, they weren't in classrooms interacting with students. So they weren't even really in touch with the people who were the primary users of the food system. So they're like, we don't know what students are thinking. We don't know, right? And so there's this kind of disconnect with both the food system and the eaters that actually makes it quite constraining to make good decisions. Those of us who are in the middle, so I now teach, and so faculty and staff, we often, based on our specific areas of interest or the programs we work in and our research, have a lot of expertise, and we do have the ability to connect with senior administration, and we also have connections with students, right? So we can kind of be this fulcrum that's in the middle. The challenge for us is that we often have little control. We're not the ones signing off on the contract. So we don't have kind of authorization capacity. And we often need to refer to students for validation, because it's like, we may have all of these ideas, but is this really what students are wanting, right? And so we kind of we have the ability to reach in both directions, but we also need both of those players, both of those stakeholders to really validate what we might be able to see. The advantage that students have, and I would say that this is true, and I found this to be true as I've talked to folks in hospitals, in public schools, in prisons, like a lot of places where people are eating as part of institutional food systems. The people who are eating, in terms, again, as I was saying, in terms of quantity, they have a lot of collective power because there's a lot of them, right? And we've seen that in a couple of cases where students have really risen up in protest, and that's led to some big shifts in food systems overnight or over the course of a week, because their voices have power. Students don't often recognize, or eaters don't often recognize this power and feel pretty powerless because they often don't have a lot of information about the food system, right? It's like, I don't know who to go to. I don't even know what's actually going on. There's a lack of transparency and a lack of organizational knowledge. So yeah, we can turn the image off. But the reason I wanted to put this up there is that through the process of this research and talking with other institutions, what we realize is that one of the really major leverage points is to connect these people. So at Acadia, we have something called the Acadia Food Services Advisory Committee. And this committee is a committee where students, faculty, staff, all sit together. We used to have the food service provider be a part of this committee, but at some point we made a very intentional decision to not have them be part of it because we felt like there needed to be an internal institutional vision and clarity around what the values of the institution are, and then interact from that point. And then this committee, and it was like many, many years of there being buy-in from senior administration to have all of these voices at the table, right? Because again, this is not typical. This is not how it usually functions. But we had to kind of build a sense of trust and understanding about why it was really important to have all these people as part of the conversation, and then have a set up structures that we report to the folks who are making the final decisions. And maybe the other thing I'll say is that one of the pretty significant changes that happened was that this last contract that we signed was the first time at Acadia, and it is fairly unusual, was that the folks on this committee all sat as part of we helped shape and decide on what the criteria and what the key performance indicators would be for the contract. So the contract that went out for food services, we helped shape what that contract looked like as part of the request for proposal process. So right in that process, we said to folks, if you want to apply to be the food service provider for Acadia, here are the targets that you're going to have to meet over the course of your contract. And we could then sit around the table and evaluate those food service providers based on whether they met those criteria or not. And this included everybody on that committee. So it meant the students for the first time had a vote on that committee, faculty had a vote on that committee, and staff, including, for example, our sustainability manager at Acadia, was sitting on that committee to make a decision about who the food service provider would be. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to jump over to Andy, but before I do that, I'm sensing a commonality here where to get a procurement system working optimally, it's got to be integrated across all tiers of the organization. And Kimberly, you're shaking your head up and down. Yes, so you're understanding that right down to somebody with the P card, for example, understand the strategy, knowing they've got the backup support that they can do it that way. And the same with you. That's really been, seems like the core of your research, Chaiti, is understanding that interaction, you know, and the staff and the faculty in the middle. And I love the phrase, the eaters, because we all got to eat at some level. So Andy, let me jump to you. We're going to be doing this anchor institution work, and it strikes me it's the same thing. You know, you're working with some of the managers there, some of the senior people, and it's really got to come all the way down to the people that are going to spend the money. So tell us a bit about that.
Well, it's interesting. It's easy to focus on the spend analysis, crunching through the numbers, and that's a pretty easy, the easiest part of the process. I think the more interesting, more challenging part is kind of reorienting procurement staff into the notion that they are actually that their role in community development, and that they actually have a role beyond beyond just procuring goods and services for their institution, and that they're spending, especially public institutions who are spending, our tax dollars, have the potential to make a pretty transformative impact on their local communities. So, we will be doing a series of 3 in-person sessions with the representatives from the 5 anchors, and just to kind of a big part of that is to bring them along to that understanding, to see what's been done in other jurisdictions, both abroad and much closer to home, like at Acadia, just so they can start getting a sense of this thing that they're part of, which, the framework that we work within is a thing called community wealth building, and anchor institution procurement is a key driver, a key pillar for that larger framework, and helping them to get an understanding of the role that they can play within the broader within that broader framework, which is much bigger and more interesting, frankly, than just buying goods and services. And it's been proven to work in like all over the world now, and and there are great examples of the Cleveland University Hospital System back in the early 2000s, we're able to localize over $1 billion, around a major capital project, and it was transformative for the state, the businesses in that state. There were new co-ops that were developed, minority-owned, female-owned, and then that got replicated in Preston and in the UK, and has been replicated all through the West Midlands of England. And they really now see themselves, those institutions now see that the role they have beyond their kind of stated purpose, whether they're a hospital or a university or a police force or a municipality, they have this very direct role in impacting the economic welfare of their local community, whether that's like the immediate community or the county, the province, the country. So we'll be integrating into those working sessions where we're kind of focusing on this analysis. We'll be helping to bring along the understanding of the role that they can play just by seeing what's being done. I mean, this is a well-proven strategy now, has been on the go for at least 20 years. And it's something that I think that once they get the sense of it, I think, and can become incentivized around that. I think that's a big part of it, is that currently procurement staff, general, it's my understanding, they're not incentivized to think in this way. Like they focus on price, quality, and risk, right? And they don't think about a community benefit necessarily. So a big part of this is kind of ideally engaging with senior level decision makers to help them kind of set the climate for that kind of broader thinking of the role of procurement within their institution and their community.
Yeah, it's interesting you should invoke the Preston example. I heard it's now described as the Preston effect, where what start with some 6 anchor institutions. It was a rundown industrial town in northern England, and they started spending as much as they could locally, and scroll forward a few years, and then KPMG comes along, gives an award as the most economically improved city in England.
Yeah, just in 4 years, they increased their spending within the city limits by 75 million pounds per year. Was relocalized within the city, and then 200 million pounds within Lancashire, the broader county. So, and it was just, and I think when it was all in, I think there were a dozen anchors that ultimately participated, beyond the 6 that started. So, again, can just have this huge impact, and they were voted the best, the most improved city, and it was all triggered by the collapse of a major retail development that I think around 2008 that it with the financial crash triggered the collapse of this big retail development they were betting the farm on, and it didn't come to fruition, and that kind of got them unstuck and started thinking about new ways of doing things, and sometimes that's what it takes. And in our case, it's perhaps what's happening south of the border with the tariff situation is hopefully getting us to think differently in terms of how we spend our money.
Yeah. Chaiti, on that note, this sort of multiplier effect that we're talking about, we're a number of years now into this localization procurement for food vendors, or for Acadia, I should say. Have you seen or heard of any effects with the producers and the vendors in Nova Scotia, or particularly in the Valley area, because of the contract?
I mean, yes, but I feel like it's happening in more kind of, subtle ways, in the sense that we had production capacity here. And so one of the things that I learned as I was looking at procurement was we had capacity to meet a number of the requirements or the kind of food demand that an institution like Acadia would require. And as our number climbed higher, it did mean what it means for producers. And as I was speaking with producers, one of the things that comes back is that a lot of those smaller producers have more kind of direct access to consumers. So you might have through a farmer's market, or you might have through smaller contracts. But the thing that an institution can really provide is having a more steady, right? It's like they know from having mapped their food procurement for many years. It's like, this is how many 1,000 pounds of carrots we require over the course of a year, or this is, right? And so it's like there's some kind of it's a different kind of market, and having an access to a market that's multitudinous. So having something that's like we require 1 or 2 products, but we require large quantities of them. And then you still have the markets that you had existing. It provides a level of stability by just having these multiple points of access. And one of the things that comes to mind now, this is not the product isn't local, but one of the businesses that we have locally is Just Us Coffee Roasters. So it's a co-op business model. They do work with small producers exclusively to bring in coffee and cacao products, but primarily coffee and some tea. And so that was a partnership. They're also fair trade and organic certified, but they go beyond kind of what the fair trade requirements are, and really being in conversation with producer communities about what can be sustainable for them, both ecologically, but also financially and in terms of the communities. And so one of the things that this focus in shift in procurement opened up for us was being able to establish a direct partnership with them. They ended up establishing a brand of coffee that's in Acadia. You know, they came to campus, they did a tasting, so students voted on which coffee they liked the best. They now bag it with an Acadia brand. And so there are these kinds of partnerships that then become long-term, right? And so obviously we're one buyer from them, but it just means that people have multiple anchors that can provide sustainability when you're a small business. And so the institutional market can provide that sort of one more piece or one more pillar in the stability of a local economy.
And that's interesting. And I'm imagining students need a lot of coffee.
There might be some of that happening.
Professors too, I would say.
You know, we're bandying about this phrase local, and I know that it can be a slippery word. And trying to, particularly what the three of you are doing, trying to avoid it just being a warm and fuzzy word, trying to tie it down a little bit better. How do you define it? What is local? So Kimberley, I'd like to come back to you in terms of the strategy for the province and what is local? What kind of lens is there around a local supplier and how you define that?
For the province, local has been defined for many years as the address at which we are invoicing. So if you are local and you own and operate your organization within Nova Scotia, then local, you would be considered local. And it's tied back to our financial management system where head office might not be in the province, but those that do the work are. However, wherever we are invoicing, where we're receiving the invoice from and where we're sending our money, that's where we would be considering who's local. It's different for different public sector entities around the province, but for us, that's what we have identified. And I'm about to put in the chat here, we're talking about food, and earlier in my comments, I said that it's important for suppliers within the province to know what's happening on a larger scale across the province. And we've recently put out some tenders earlier this year for the school lunch programs. And we have tendered for 2 different types. One is on-site food preparation and the other one is off-site food preparation. So the award information that you see in there shows that the companies that have been awarded the contracts are from Nova Scotia, or at least have been considered to be local. And one of them is the Horizon Achievement Center. So we're working not just with the traditional people that are providing food, but also those that are in have different makeups of their business and are able to provide the food through their catering businesses and things like that. So I'm bringing this to your attention because it was a short procurement. We were given a very short time frame to get this up and running, and it is something that's been implemented across all schools within the province. And those companies that were successful are all listed on our website. So if there are certain companies that are here that are in the world of producing, there may be opportunities for you to connect with them to see what types of things they could use in the preparation for the school lunch program.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for that link.
There's 2 different links in there. There's 2 different projects, but you should be able to find them.
Okay. Yes, thank you. And I'm curious, it's a relatively new strategy that rolled out. Is there goals or key performance indicators, or, where would you like to be in a number of years' time with this strategy?
With this strategy, that's probably a better question for the procurement specialists and the departments that were working on it. But I would say that from my point of view, I would like to see that they have some really tangible metrics from how this program has worked. And with one procurement managing the school lunch program within schools all across the province, we will be able to do some reporting on that and have some really good feedback from the institutions themselves. Whereas there's one group that's managing the project. And so I think what I'd like to see is that long term, this is something that becomes just part of how we do school lunches and how we feed our children in schools. I've heard that some of the lunches that aren't purchased through the day, that if there's any left over, that they're sent home with children that could use additional food at home or whatever. So there's another spinoff that comes from that. And then I'm thinking that perhaps children will become more familiar with eating healthy, eating what they could be informed of as being local, and then become a little bit more interested in that when they're, old enough to do their own shopping. That's kind of a lofty goal, but at the end of the day, it's something that if children know where their food is coming from, then that can help change their perception as they get older.
Yes, fully agreed there. It really helps for young children to be able to pull the carrot out of the ground.
Yeah,
Where does
know
food,
what to do with it.
that kind of thing. But I see what you mean about knowing where you're starting from and having some sort of metrics of how much are you moving the needle. And that seems to be a real important part.
And like Acadia and the cafeteria, the success of this will only be, if the children like the food. So the same metric should potentially be applied the next time is, bring in some kids that can give some input into the food that's being served. I mean, it all has to fall within the nutritional guidelines that are set out by the province. But for us, I think the biggest thing would be to make sure that it's a functional program that can be expanded beyond the elementary school years as well.
Yes, definitely. Andy, just to jump back to you, is that something that we've got baked into the project there? As starting with the spending analysis, you're sort of setting the gauge on where the money goes, and then from there, can you track where it could go, and maybe if coming back a year, 2, 3 headed in the future and seeing what happened?
Yeah, that's a key indicator. Is tracking the total spend by locality and doing it longitudinally. That's been done really effectively with all the implementations that have happened in England. They've tracked year over year, and I think that's just a great measure, very concrete. People can wrap their head around, that how much more money is being spent within the province or county or city. Yeah, absolutely. That's really the premise for this project, is to establish that initial spend analysis as the baseline, which will then be provide the basis for what hopefully will be a longitudinal tracking.
Okay. Liv, I don't see any questions in the chat box. I want to throw it out to everybody online. This is your chance. We've got a few minutes left here. If you've got a question, just jump right in. You could either do it in the chat box or just open up your mic. We've got good representations, I think, here on local procurement, and it's been, of course, tends to, for some reason, always orient a little bit more around food, but that's probably very appropriate. With mouths to feed, particularly with some of the institutions, the educational setting, hospitals. I know the Nova Scotia Health Authority's been really trying to be on this. Kimberley, you probably know about that. for quite a number of years, actually, really trying to keep the metrics on how much local procurement in hospitals.
Yes, we do have a group that works with us in our procurement office, and they're called Health Pro. And they do have a food services team member that does work with the health authority to ensure that the contracts that are put out for the food that's served within the hospitals can include some local pieces to it with their contracts that they put out for. They put contracts out for hospitals all across the country, but the folks that we have on staff here focus on the Nova Scotia Health Authority.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Justin, you've got your hand up there. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much. I really appreciate the presentation and you guys sharing your wisdom and what is such a complex realm in procurement. I guess it's something that I'm curious about is just I was excited to see the document that you shared, and I'm curious about best value as we move forward into a realm where maybe some things on paper might cost more or be perceived to cost more from a price perspective upfront. As we start to look at things like the regional economic multiplier effect of localizing procurement, as we look at maybe some of the environmental and ecological benefits of localized production, as we look at some of the potential health outcomes of local food. I'm curious, if there's different frameworks that are going into the sort of algorithm that determines best value. Because sometimes, and I know this isn't always the case, but sometimes it's almost like a race to the cheapest. And then the three bids on the tender that are considered are the cheaper ones. And we're not necessarily looking at what the multiplied effect might be from, for example, localizing procurement from imported commodity foods to locally sourced commodity foods. Knowing that that's like, a challenge, but it seems to sometimes be a bit of a catch-22 for some of the folks that I've worked with who are tender curious.
So kind of looking at value versus price is to really bring, and Kimberly, you might be the best position to really speak to that.
Yeah, so for a number of years, we have implemented the best value approach to our procurement. And so with the higher value opportunities that go out for public tender, we do have the ability to build into the evaluation criteria a lot of different things that will allow us to look at the value added that's brought to the project rather than just price. So if there are attributes of sustainability, of anything that brings more value to the project than just how much it costs, then those things we have been evaluating for quite some time. The trick for us right now will be to figure out a way to build the resources that will help our client departments buying the low value at the higher end of that scale, apply some of those evaluative criteria so that it's not onerous for the supplier who's bidding on something at a low value level, but that it still brings the best value. And some of that is included in the favorable treatment of Nova Scotia businesses, where we can apply a 10% difference to the lowest value. But if it means that we can work with a Nova Scotia company, then that's some of the work that we're doing. But you're right, it is a difficult thing to build into every procurement to ensure that we're not missing something in the way of best value. And sometimes that means that we just need to ask suppliers, what does best value mean? Like, what can you bring to us that we haven't maybe considered in the past? So that's a good question. Thank you.
All right. Thank you both. Well, we're out of time. Again, I want to thank Kimberly, Chaiti, and Andy as well for being on this webinar and providing incredibly valuable insights on local procurement. I'm trusting that it's going to be a growing momentum in the years ahead. I do want to say that there's some valuable links in the chat box, and please save your chat box if you want to capture those. If you go to the chat, there's those 3 dots in the upper corner, and you should be able to save your chat. In our next month's webinar, it's still a topic I think to be decided, but we're looking at localized investment, particularly maybe around CEDIFs. We still have to confirm that. That would be, of course, on the last Thursday of the month on November 27th. If you're not already on our newsletter, go to our website and sign up. You'll be able to really keep track of all kinds of upcoming events. Andy, why don't you jump in there? I think you've got something to say about next month.
Yeah, no, we have just confirmed next month's webinar. It's going to feature Mark Allman from the new company Backer, which is a CEDIF funded company that'll help create other CEDIFs for local companies, and Mark will bring in at least one of the company's first clients as well to speak about the work they're going to be doing. So it's should be quite an interesting, a bit more specific, a more focused discussion about what Backer is going to be doing in the coming months and years.
All right, that's good news. Good to hear that, Andy. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, moving from local procurement next month to local investment. So again, thank you, everyone, and look forward to seeing you next month.
Thanks.
Thanks, Bob.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.